The revolution's begun. The time to stand up has come. We are the rocking of the throne. We are the rocking of the throne.
Hi, my name's Victor Tiffany. I'm the co-founder of Revolt against Plutocracy, the organization that was behind the Burn Your Bus pledge movement of 2016. Donald Trump is President of the United States. He's a climate change denier. And with Scott Pruitt as head of the EPA, we're in trouble. Our climate is already in transition toward a new, potentially species-threatening status. Call it Desert Earth, call it Venus Earth. We are in transition towards something horrible if we don't curb climate change, if we don't figure out a way to preserve the climate and help us hang on until 2016 or 2020 and a new progressive administration that will actually help systematically at a national level transform this fossil fuel sector into sustainable energy systems. Therefore, it's up to us. If we're going to preserve the climate, then we need to take action. I'm going to outline a strategy which will do two things. It'll resist Trump and undermine his efforts to make America great again and help preserve the economy. It's a strategy I call revolutionary consumption. And it's basically simple. I will elaborate on with details after I summarize this. But to give people a quick understanding, in the Twitter age, people have time for 1-hour discussions or monologues. I will just quickly outline. Cut your consumption. If you need to buy something, buy it. If you can make do, don't buy it. This will do two things. It'll reduce your carbon footprint. And this is especially a factor in energy consumption. Turn lights off. Don't travel as far as you're used to. Don't travel at all if you don't need to. Going out to dinner, stay home. Anytime you can cut energy use, turning lights off, television off, directly curbs your carbon footprint, reduces your carbon footprint. But any reduced consumption reduces carbon footprint, whether it's because you're driving to the store or somebody's delivering something to your home. That's energy that can be saved by not buying new stuff. The other thing that will do is slow the economy down. Right? The more people who are involved with this, the more we'll slow it down. And the idea is to undermine Trump's ability to make America great again. And that's going to be decided upon one factor: how the economy performs under Donald Trump. If we cut our consumption, the economy is based on effective demand. Right? If you go out and buy things, you're going to help stimulate the economy. If we consciously and conscientiously decide to curb our consumption, buy less, only buy what we truly need, then we'll slow the economy. And that will be reflected in the midterm elections. If the economy's on a downturn, people are going to say, whoa, this president isn't working so well. Or in his re-election bid, assuming he gets that far, and this is true for Mike Pence as well, if he ends up being the president, voters are more likely to lean toward alternatives, progressive alternatives, if they can lay out a strategy that will both increase jobs and transform the energy sector of our economy into sustainable energy systems. So, details. The more money you make, the better your standard of living, the more you can do to resist Trump. Poor people already only spend for what they need. That's all they can afford. Working class and middle class Americans can have dozens of ways that they can curb their consumption. If you have something that works, make do. If you drive a gas guzzler, don't go out and buy a new vehicle just because you want to reduce your gas consumption because that increases your carbon footprint. When your vehicle, your gas guzzler, no longer is good enough because you're spending more money repairing it every month than it would cost to purchase a new car, then buy a Prius or an electric car or any gas sipping vehicle. That's the time to finally do it because you need it at that point. If you total a vehicle, then go ahead and purchase a high mileage vehicle to replace it. Again, you have to be smart here. We can't just think we're doing the right thing that turns out to be the wrong thing. When we cut our consumption, we will reduce the GDP. Now that's going to cause people to lose their jobs. And one way to counter that is through what I call targeted consumption. Economist Joseph Schumpeter talked about creative destruction, which has gone on throughout history. The people who used to make sails for merchant ships lost their jobs when the steam engine was put into position and created and installed on ships. They lost their jobs when the internal combustion engine was installed on merchant ships. So the idea is we want to creatively target consumption for green energy and get people employed installing solar systems on rooftops, small windmills on rooftops, geothermal systems on the property. Again, this is for homeowners. Renters basically are going to be at the forefront of constraining consumption. The most they could do really is replace gas guzzlers with sipping vehicles. And I'm not talking about the purchase of used equipment, used clothing, used furniture, used cars. Right? This is about cutting demand for new consumer stuff. That's how we adversely affect the economy. So there's a strategy, a larger strategy that people need to pay attention to. When 1,000 people are radically cutting their consumption, it's not going to put a ripple in the overall national economy. When 10,000 people radically reduce their consumption, then it's going to ripple. It'll slow economic growth, but it won't put economy into a downturn. It won't cause the GDP to shrink, and that's what we're aiming to do. When 100,000 people radically reduce their consumption, then we're looking at the potential of turning the economy, slowing the economy down, and reducing GDP. So we need to pay attention to the quarterly GDP reports, because what we do not want to do is crash the economy. We don't want to drive the national economy into a ditch. While that would be bad for Donald Trump and better for the climate, it would be horrible for the millions of people who would be thrown out of work and thrown out of their homes. Right? We don't want a repeat of the crash of 2008. We don't want a repeat of the Great Recession. We want to be basically human regulators, cut our consumption, reduce the economy, and slow the economy. It'll undermine Trump and help preserve the environment, the climate. If, as we continue to recruit more people to cut consumption, we see the GDP decline 2 quarters in a row, then we have enough people in our movement, and we need to spend some of the money we've saved over the last 2 quarters in order to produce slight amount of economic growth. We don't want to cause a recession. We just want to keep growth largely negative. So we want to have 1 quarter of growth, 2 quarters of decline. 1 quarter of growth, 2 quarters of decline, to serve as a governor on the economy, keeping it slowed down. We're going to serve as a brake on the economy and slow it down to undermine Trump and help preserve the climate until a national policy can be put in place. Now, There are things that can be done at the state level, in blue states, where a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature might be open to large-scale green energy projects. That's the place to attempt to establish experiments in large-scale transformation of the energy sector from fossil fuels to green. The technology to resurface roads with solar cells is in place. It's, as I said in Philadelphia outside during the Bernier bus rally, all the technology needed to transform the economy is off the shelf. We can do this. We just need the political will, and we can demand in blue states where the possibility is there to resurface roads with these solar collectors. Right? This will do so much to advance the cause of alternative energy sources. Roads would require less service. You don't have to, they're self-heating, so you don't have to salt them in the wintertime. You don't have to plow them in the wintertime. People will have fewer accidents, so insurance costs will go down. The upfront cost is huge, right? My idea of this is to use a bond act to fund this thing, several $billions to get it started. And as these solar roads go into service, the state will have energy to sell the utility companies. That money, that income, can be used to continue to build more solar roads until every road in a state is covered with solar collectors, at which point the state will have enormous income from the sale of that energy to the utility companies to help maintain the cost of these roads, because, you know, these, like any road, they will be damaged from accidents and heavy trucks and so forth. And it'll also provide income for education and other advancements of energy transformation. So that there are things we can do to promote in blue states energy sector transformation. Now, one more point I want to address, and that's the upcoming People's Climate Movement March on Washington, April 29th. While it's hard to argue against marches for the climate and climate preservation marches on D.C., is it really smart to pull people in from around the country for a centralized national march on Washington? I'm not against a march on Washington, but I think the Women's March, the day after the inauguration, serves as a role model for what can be done going forward that will reduce people, you know, the energy used in order to pull people from around the country into a central location for a large rally. I'm all for large rallies, but it makes more sense to me to have a rally in Washington using or pulling in people from the greater Washington, Baltimore area for a large rally on the Washington Mall or wherever they have it, and then another rally in Washington, in New York City. I'll just use New York State as an example. In Syracuse, in Binghamton, in Buffalo, to decentralize these marches but coordinate them so that they become as newsworthy as the Women's March was. This will reduce our carbon footprint as we organize more and more marches and rallies. And as we resist Trump in general, that's an opportunity to promote this idea of revolutionary consumption. Right? If you want to undermine Donald Trump, spread the word. Share this video on social media. Share this idea at Trump actions, whether you're an airport supporting refugees trying to come into the country, or you're at a march for the environment or a march of the scientists opposing Trump. Anytime you're in an organized effort to oppose Trump, you can help promote revolutionary consumption. But it's important to stress, keep your eye on the GDP reports, the quarterly GDP reports, and don't send the economy into a crash. If you want to consume and you're a homeowner, build energy systems onto your house. That's a way to creatively destroy the fossil fuel sector of the economy until we have a progressive in the White House who can undertake this on a national scale. That's our best approach towards saving the economy. Thank you for listening, and let's do this. Let's stop Donald Trump and save the world. My name's Victor Tiffany. I'm the co-founder of Revolt Against Plutocracy, the organization behind the Bernie or Bust pledge movement from last year. And we have a serious problem on our hands. We have a man in the White House who's a climate change denier. Scott Pruitt was just authorized or okayed by the Senate to be the head of the EPA, an organization that he's always opposed. So it's very clear there's not going to be anything happening in Washington or coming from Washington in terms of protecting the climate, preserving the climate as something close to what we have today. Therefore, it's up to us. There's no getting around it. If people don't start taking action, cut their carbon footprint radically compared to what we've been doing over the last 20, 50 years, we're pretty much doomed. There's mass extinctions underway, and it's going to be horrible. If we don't somehow hang on by lowering our carbon footprint as much as possible in the coming 4 years, so we can get a progressive into the White House and do what needs to be done for a green transformation of the energy sector from fossil fuels to sustainable energy, then it won't matter by then. We may be too far down the road toward what may ultimately become extinction. This is that serious. So the idea is to do an act of preservation by cutting consumption, what I call revolutionary consumption, and to resist Trump in the same strategy by consuming less, eating differently, eating less meat, becoming a vegetarian, various things people can do with their food. If you're thinking about building an addition to your house, wait. If you have one underway, then obviously you want to go ahead and get that finished up. But there's so many ways most people can cut their consumption. Now, if you're poor, if you're one of America's poor people who are barely getting by, and you're already purchasing, the only thing you can afford is what you need, this pretty much doesn't apply to you. But for most people who have the cash to go out and buy what they want, as on top of what they need, this is for you. When you cut your consumption, you reduce your carbon footprint, and this is especially true with direct energy use. You can turn heat down in your house, you can turn lights off when they're not in use, turn the television or radio off when you're not listening to it. There's dozens of ways most households can reduce their energy consumption. And if you're richer, if you're upper middle class, there are probably thousands of ways people can reduce their carbon footprint. Don't go on vacation. Don't go long distances on vacation. And it's not like we want to do this. Right? We want to go to Europe. We want to go to California, Hawaii. It's that if we keep consuming at the levels we've been consuming for the last, whatever, 20, 30, 50 years, we may not make it to a progressive president in the White House who can take the necessary radical steps to transform the energy sector from fossil fuels to sustainable energy sources. So this is twofold. This has got two purposes. One, to preserve the climate as what we have today, and two, to slow the economy, to consciously and intentionally slow the economy, because it's based upon demand, right? The economy is fueled by consumer demand. So if there's no demand, it won't matter how much oil they pump out of the ground. It'll still adversely affect the environment. But if it's not burnt because it's used, or it's not burnt in large quantities like we do today, it's going to cut our carbon input, our carbon use, our carbon footprint, and it's going to slow the economy. This is where we resist Trump. Right? If his big thing is, I'm going to make America great again, I'm going to build the economy, it's going to grow. And if we cut our consumption sufficiently, it's not going to grow. Now, this is going to take a movement. So if there's 1,000 people who have radically cut their consumption, it's not going to be a dent, it's not going to be barely a ripple in the national economy. If 10,000 people start radically reducing their consumption, it will be a ripple in the economy, but it's not likely to slow the economy. It may slow the acceleration, the growth of the economy, but it's not going to overall slow the economy. And what we want to do is borderline recession. Barely slow the economy. If 100,000 people are doing this, radically reducing their consumption of stuff, whatever stuff they want, then you might have the ability to actually start slowing the economy down. And we have to pay attention to the quarterly reports on economic growth. Until the GDP actually goes into the negative, right, and it actually starts slowing the economy, which will undermine Trump and it'll undermine the Republicans and give progressives a better shot at winning elections, because they're going to be able to make the case for green alternatives. What we need to do is if the economy does slow, there's 100,000 people cutting their consumption, there's 1 million people cutting their consumption, there's 10 million people cutting their consumption. What we want to be careful about is not crashing the economy. We don't want to drive the economy off into the ditch, because that'll harm an awful lot of people. And we don't want that to happen. We just want to slow the economy and use the social safety net that's there to protect the people who do get laid off. There will be some layoffs involved. Anytime you cut consumption, you're going to lead to cut production, and that's going to cause layoffs. Now, one way homeowners can, it's called creative destruction. We're going to destroy the fossil fuel sector and create a sustainable energy sector. And this is only for homeowners, right? Homeowners, instead of just saving money and setting it aside and saving money that's not being spent for new stuff, they can instead spend money on green energy sources. You can get a rooftop windmill attached to your house. You can cover your roof with solar panels if you get much sun at all. You can have a geothermal system installed for heat and hot water. There's a lot of things you can do to actually help the employment situation as more and more people consume less and less. So that's one way to make sure that the economy doesn't crash, to make sure that while some people are being laid off, other people find employment installing solar panels, rooftop windmills, and so forth. Again, as this movement grows, as more and more people cut their consumption, we have to pay more and more attention to the quarterly reports on GDP. If we have 2 quarters in a row of negative growth, of borderline recession, then we actually have to start spending some money again. Not everything we've saved, but part of what we've saved in order to make sure we don't slip into a recession. So we want to go in and out of growth and decline. 1 quarter growth, 1 quarter decline, 1 quarter growth, 1 quarter decline. Because we don't want a full-bore recession. We don't want to crash the economy. We want to slow the economy. And that's going to take just awareness on the part of everybody who's participating in this consumer boycott. I think I talked earlier when I couldn't be heard. There are things that can be done at the state level, particularly in blue states like New York, where we can appeal to the New York Senate and the New York Assembly and encourage them to accelerate green energy systems. They have off-the-shelf technology now that they can use to resurface roads with solar collectors. Right? This might initially require a bond act of several $billion, maybe $50 billion. It'll be very expensive up front, resurfacing roads with solar collectors. But as these solar roads go into use, it'll actually produce an income as the state sells their collected solar energy to utility companies, and then they convert that into alternating current and sell it to homes and businesses within the state. So there's things that can be done at the state level to promote the transformation from fossil fuels to sustainable energy. But broadly speaking, we're not going to see anything coming out of the national government. States are going to have to be the experiments for democratic action on massive, large-scale conversion to green energy. So I think that pretty much covers it. If there's so many different ways to cut consumption, unless you're a poor person. Poor people don't have surplus income. All they have is enough money to buy what they need. But those who are working class, middle class, we can go out to dinner less, stay home, cook at home. It uses less energy because you're not driving around. And slow this economy. It'll reduce our carbon footprint and undermine Donald Trump. His big thing is, I'm going to make America great again. Well, we can consciously make America a little less great, and that basically always boils around the economy. As they said in 1992, it's the economy, stupid. Well, it's the climate, people, and that's what we have to get a handle on. And by reducing our carbon footprint, we can undermine Donald Trump. I just want to speak to the national. Let's see if I can find this thing and get the exact date. There it is. There's a national march on Washington on April 29th. This is being put on by 350.org. And what that seems like a good idea, except having a central national protest and people traveling from all over the country to get to Washington for this protest basically says, oh, we're going to consume a whole bunch of energy getting to Washington so we can protest energy use and energy abuse. So while I support 350.org's overall goal and ambition to cut carbon, I think these kind of national centralized protests, we need to think new. I mean, we can't keep doing things the way we've been doing things in the past. So for people who live in the greater Washington and Baltimore area, I would say go ahead and go to that April 29th March on Washington. But if I just don't understand the idea of people traveling from all over the country in their cars and their buses and spewing all this carbon in order to go and protest climate change. and environmental protection. It doesn't make any sense to me. We need local marches and local protests so that we're not using so much gasoline to protest the use of gasoline and the production of gasoline and the destruction of our climate. So I'm rather ambivalent about the March on Washington on April 29th. Now, I'd love to take questions if I could only see them. What I'm going to try to do is flip to another screen, and maybe Sandy can copy and paste questions people have into a message box which I have open to communicate with her, and then I'll see what people are asking, and if there's anything I can do to answer questions people have. I don't hear anything yet. I think maybe we can do Q&A in the comment section afterwards. That might be a question coming through. March in Science. I don't know if I said March in Science. It was a march in April on Washington, April 29th. That's being planned by 350.org. If I misspoke, I apologize. Let's see, there's a question on the date. I have April 29th. I actually have their page, the peoplesclimate.org page, open, and they're talking about a April 29th march on Washington. Now, this is April 29th. This isn't March. I'm not speaking to a March. A march on Washington in March. I'm speaking about the climate march on April 29th. Yeah, I just think we need to rethink these centralized national marches. And I mean, Black Lives Matter doesn't take their action to Washington. They act locally. And I think we need to learn from their kind of, knocking my microphone around here. I think we need to learn from their kind of direct action activities that are locally based. Are there any other questions? I don't see anything coming through Sandy's message box. We can wrap this up if we want and do questions. I'll keep my eye on this video in the comment section when we're done. Do I follow modern monetary theory? Largely, yes. I don't think I haven't talked about spending on these climates. I'm just talking about personal spending. And households are not, they're a unit within the national economy, and that's what I'm encouraging people to reduce, right? Reduce their consumption and so forth. But yeah, largely I've learned about modern monetary theory this last year, and I do follow it, but I don't know how relevant it is in this conversation. Let's see, another question. Apparently somebody wants me to talk about modern monetary theory. I'm no expert. Steve Grumbine knows a lot more about modern monetary theory than I do. So he'd be the person really to address in this way. But broadly, we don't need to raise taxes to spend money. We can just spend money. I know that sounds bizarre. You know what? This is going to produce more debt and more deficits, but they don't matter. They're ones and zeros on a spreadsheet. And I know that flies in the face of conventional thinking. It took me a while to get my head to wrap around this whole idea of we don't need an income to spend money as a federal government because we are a sovereign nation and we have sovereign currency, right? So we're not on the gold standard. The idea of having to balance the budget is from the time when we were on the gold standard. That's history. We don't need to do that anymore. See if there's another question over here that I can address. I guess there's a question about my thoughts on scientists against Trump. I think everybody should be against Trump. I've actually started watching Shepard Smith on Fox News because my view is if Fox starts turning against Trump, then he's in bigger trouble than what we think. I mean, obviously MSNBC's going to rail against Trump, and you'll have critics of Trump on CNN. But yesterday, Shep Smith called Trump out for his lie after his lie after his lie from his press conference. It was really quite remarkable to see. So when Fox News starts calling Trump out on his lies, I think an indication that we have a president who's just completely out of touch. I mean, we know he's out of touch, but when you've got the conservative channel calling Trump out for his deceptions and his misstatements of facts, as they put it, it's a serious issue. I think, like I said, I'm glad the scientists are coming out. I'd like to see civil servants go on strike. I think some of these leaks are coming from the intelligence community are a sign that there's people in the intelligence community that are not supporting Trump. Obviously, they're not supporting Trump, but they're willing to get the truth out to people about what he's up to. Let's see if there's any other questions. So I guess there's concerns about other marches that are taking place in Washington. I just would reiterate, we need to think nationally, think globally, and act locally, and that includes marches. I just think it's kind of hypocritical to gather people from all around the country to come to Washington, fly to Washington, take buses to Washington, carpool to Washington. All this traveling spews carbon into the atmosphere, and that's what we're trying to stop. It's a much cleaner, simpler strategy, and it can be organized online for climate activists, whether it's Bill McKibben and 350.org or the scientists or any organized group. They just encourage people to start spending less, and particularly with regard to fossil fuels, to slow down, to minimize our travel, and to not go out and buy a new car just because it has lower mileage, but when your car is so expensive to repair month after month and it's time to buy a new car or a replacement car, then go ahead and get a vehicle with higher mileage, a Prius, an electric car, and so forth. Other questions? Operation Low Tax. I did see a suggestion on a democracy leader listserv this week of somebody saying, don't pay your taxes. Which sounds like a good idea if you want to get penalized and possibly arrested for tax avoidance. That's what I'm suggesting. By lowering consumption is perfectly legal. Right? There's nothing they can do. If we decide as opponents to Donald Trump and environmentalists that we're just going to consume less, it's perfectly legal, it's perfectly safe. There's nothing anybody can do to make us buy things we don't want to buy. Obviously, we have to buy some things, but we don't have to buy things we don't need, right? It's perfectly legal. See if there's another question. Government save. What would you have paid the government? You save instead, and then when you do your taxes, have money saved in the credit union. No, do this legal. S10 is illegal. Only federal tax. I'm being asked questions about S10 forms and tax savings and so forth, and I'm not a tax expert. So I'll have to suggest you speak to your accountant about that, because I'm just not, it's not my thing. I don't even do my taxes anymore. Claiming single 10 gives Fed so much less money. I see what the idea is too. A number of people you claim, I have for a long time, when I was doing my own taxes, did my best to not give the government an interest-free loan. But again, that's a personal decision you have to make, and it really does nothing in terms of reducing our carbon footprint. And that's really what I want to focus this live stream on, is cut your carbon footprint, cut your consumption. If you're a homeowner, purchase green energy systems. It'll help employ people who are going to be laid off, or some of the people, you know, it'll keep the unemployment situation manageable rather than a broad, no holds barred consumer boycott. At least consuming green energy products, solar systems for rooftops and so forth, you're helping employ some people, and at the same time hopefully helping people in the energy sector get laid off. That's the idea. It's called creative destruction. It goes back many centuries. Just to give you an idea, people who used to make sails for merchant ships were put out of business when the steam engine came along. And those people did great for, what, 100, 200 years, and then they were put out of business when the internal combustion engine came along. So this is the same kind of creative destruction that I'm suggesting by eliminating as much as possible use of carbon fuels, turn the heat down, turn lights down, and so forth. And then, again, this is only for homeowners. Purchase green energy systems for the home. In blue states, we can advocate for greater spending on energy systems, repaving or resurfacing roads with solar systems and so forth. There's a lot of things that can be done in blue states that'll serve as a model for what can be done at a national level, just as Romney Care actually was the model for what ended up becoming Obamacare. Certain states with a Democratic governor and a sufficiently blue legislature can undertake green energy projects at a statewide level that'll serve as models for when the time comes. A progressive is in the White House, and they can undertake this kind of mass conversion that Jill Stein and the Green Party advocated during the last election. See if we have any other questions. One question is, how do we reach a larger number of people in our area? And the answer is, you know, how do we build this movement? How do we reach more people for spreading this idea? Again, 1,000 people doing this isn't going to put a dent in the economy. We need 100,000 people. We need 1 million people doing this. So how do you go about doing that? And the answer is the same way we built the Bernier Bus movement, and that is to deploy social media, right? Share this video. That's why I kind of summarized it as quickly as I could. I don't know if the audio-free initial part can be cut off, or maybe I just need to produce another video that just focuses on the strategy without questions about modern monetary theory and so forth. But the idea is, you know, if you want to resist Trump, buy less and use social media, use Twitter, use Instagram, use your creativity, make your own videos. and just spread the word on social media. You can also use email. This is something we tried to deploy. I don't know with what success during the primaries and during the general election. Is build up lists of people you know, right? Just set it aside and save it as a document. I actually save my email addresses in email drafts that never get sent out. But when I want to contact a whole bunch of people, I go to the drafts and copy and paste those email addresses into the blind carbon copy section of an email. You can spread the word that way. Get the word out. You want to resist Trump? Slow the economy. And let people know that we don't want to crash the economy. We don't want to have a devastating Great Recession again. We just want to slow the economy, and if it slows 2 quarters in a row, then actually start spending a little bit more money than you have been, and again, let the economy grow just a little bit, 1 quarter of slow growth, and then recruit more people to get involved in this revolutionary consumption concept. What else we have for questions? I don't. The question is, do I advocate green protests at state capitals? Yes, I'll just take New York State for an example. We should have protests in Albany for the greater Albany region. More protests in New York City for the greater New York region. Same thing in Binghamton. Same thing in Syracuse. Same thing in Buffalo. These protests, instead of being concentrated in the nation's capital when people have to do so much traveling to get to them, these will be smaller protests, just like the Women's March was in Washington and all across the country. I think that's kind of a model for what can be done, so that the people in the Washington area and the Baltimore area can go to Washington and have a environmental green march or green protest, and then same thing as the Women's March, protest all across the country. And we did something here in Ithaca. When the McCutcheon decision was announced, we had a decision, which, by the way, was actually the very beginning of Revolt against Plutocracy. We were encouraged to make a Facebook page to promote our protests locally, and that's when I created Citizens Against Plutocracy, and that eventually became Revolt Against Plutocracy, and we ended up organizing the Burn Your Bus strategy. But when we had our protest, the media didn't show up. So when we had another protest a couple years later to try to get the media to focus on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we actually held that protest right in front of the Ithaca Journal, so they couldn't ignore us. Again, we need to be creative and we need to be local. Think globally, act locally. It's a cliche, but it's never been more important than it is now to just cut our carbon consumption. And national centralized marches do just the opposite. It actually encourages us to travel and burn more energy. Tell us a little more about our history. Well, I just talked about the genesis of our Facebook page, Citizens Against Plutocracy, which became actually, before it was Revolt Against Plutocracy, it was Pitchforks Against Plutocracy. That was after I brought Patrick Walker in to the page as an administrator, and he thought we should name it Pitchforks Against Plutocracy based upon Obama telling Wall Street bankers in his first couple of months in office, "I'm the only thing standing between you and the pitchforks." So our idea with that page was, well, we're the pitchforks. And then when we came up with this idea of a national write-in strategy for Bernie Sanders, which was a mistaken idea that actually turned out to be fortuitous because it just caught on, it caught fire. Then we changed the page to Revolt Against Plutocracy. And all this history of that movement and the upshot of that movement and a manifesto that'll be covered in a chapter called What's Next, will be coming out soon at a bookstore near you. It's a book that's essentially completed. I'm waiting on the editors to finish chapters 10, 11, and the conclusion, and then I'll go back and rewrite the introduction, and then I'll have a full manuscript that I can submit to publishers. So that whole history will be something that will be out in text form soon. What do I want for the future? Survival. We're on the cusp of extinction. There are people predicting extinction by 2025. There are most people predicting coastal cities underwater by the end of the century, if not mid-century, because ice, glaciers, Antarctica are melting at such a rapid rate. So, we're on the cusp of a major climatic catastrophe. And again, it's in our hands to slow this as much as we can as consumers. So I think that's probably enough, unless there's another question that's come up that Sandy can share with me. She says, stop the consumption. But actually, it's more subtle than that. We need to make a distinction between what we need, food, for example, and what we want. Like, new shirts. Like, if you have no shirts to wear to work, then you need shirts. But if you have 10, 20 shirts that you are okay for work, that, make do with what you have when you can. Just make do with what you have. If you're out of underwear, then you have to buy underwear. But if you're not, don't buy anything you don't need in the short run. And I think I'm just going to go ahead and stop the live stream, and any further questions I guess we can address. But you could do your own recording and get the word out on Twitter, get the word out on other social media platforms, and just make the case. If you want to stop Trump and save the climate, stop consuming stuff. Stop consuming as much as we've been consuming, because that's the best way to resist Trump. Slow the economy down carefully. Again, keep your eye. This is something we get feedback on how well this is working. Every time the government comes out with their quarterly report on GDP growth, we want to slow those numbers. It's been slowly growing. The economy's been slowly growing since we came out of the Great Recession. Well, we want to slowly decrease that growth and actually go into negative growth. And when those reports come out indicating we have negative growth, then we can relax a little bit. We don't want to spend all the money we've saved, because that would be kind of crazy. But and it would produce all the carbon that we're trying to hold on to. But we can start spending some of that money. If quarter after quarter after quarter we're not seeing a decline in GDP, then we need to recruit more people. We need to get more people behind this. So there's a scale factor that has to be coupled with a reduced consumption factor. Initially, just reduce as much consumption as you can. And as more and more people start doing that, when we get up to 100,000 people cutting their consumption, and 1 million people or 500,000 people cutting their consumption, then we have to pay attention to the GDP reports. Because again, I want to stress, we don't want to crash the economy. We don't want to drive the economy into a ditch, because that would be harmful to people struggling to make payments on their home. We don't want people on a large scale harmed by this strategy. So we have to be careful. And one counterbalancing effect homeowners can undertake is to actually purchase green energy systems that will provide some stimulus in an area where we want, and at the same time decline in areas we don't want, the consumption of fossil fuels. So thank you for listening in. We appreciate covering this. Hopefully you can talk your spouses into consuming less. I know some people, we've been so inculcated by decade after decade of corporate advertising, it's going to be hard for some people to wrap their mind around what? Stop spending? Why? I need new shoes. So maybe have them watch this and gain the idea. If you want to undermine Donald Trump and help stop the economy or stop the climate from getting wasted, then why do we want to skirt the recession? That's a good question. I've said it a few times. We don't want to crash the economy. We don't want to cause massive, widespread repeat of the Great Recession. And here's another point that I forgot to mention. There may be a bubble out there, student loan debt or some other bubble that's in place, and it bursts, say, a year from now or 2 years from now, totally outside of what we're doing as revolutionary consumers, living a more frugal life. One thing this would do, it would give a savings account. And if there's a bubble that bursts and the economy starts going into a nosedive, we who are involved in revolutionary consumption, that is minimal consumption, can actually minimize that crash so that we can help keep the economy afloat, so that any decline in the economy will harm Trump. But what we don't want to do is harm Americans on large numbers, right? We want to try to keep the economy on a fairly even keel with low negative growth, that is slow rate decline. And if there is a burst and the economy starts taking another nosedive, then people can go ahead and use that pent-up desire to get things that we want to help stimulate the economy in a time when we save it from crashing, to help people stay employed and stay in their homes. So it's a tricky situation, but if people just fully understand what it is we're trying to do, then we can actually regulate the economy as consumers and undermine Trump and make sure we don't harm people like the Great Recession harmed millions of Americans. We can actually maybe prevent that from happening if enough of us coordinate, saving as much as we can, and then if there's a crash, spend a chunk of that to help keep people employed. All right. Thank you for listening. Share this, get the word out, tweet, resist Trump, preserve the climate, stop spending so much money on stuff. Thank you for your time and attention. Have a great weekend.
Revolt Against Plutocracy won't just be covering the news about the necessary revolution in the United States. Sometimes we'll be making the news. If you want to stay on top of the revolutionary actions and strategies of grassroots, genuine progressives, and our allies, please subscribe to our YouTube channel today.